So based on that, does one need a solid background in Judaism to read or really truly appreciate Agnon?
Well, those are two different questions. To read Agnon, one does not need a solid grounding in Judaism. One need not have read all of these books behind me. You don't need to be a learned rabbi. As a matter of fact, you don't even need to do it in Hebrew. There's some very, very fine translations to English and to all other languages. Some of them edited by myself. Some of them even translated by myself, if I can toot my own translator's pen. As a matter of fact, those judges in Stockholm that gave him the Nobel Prize, the only time Hebrew literature was so honored, they all read him in translation. It's a very typically chauvinistic Israeli question, which is posed to me all the time. How could you possibly read Agnon in translation? How could you translate Agnon, right? Which is the same question you could get in the streets of Moscow about Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. It's the same question you could get in Madrid about Cervantes. It's the same question you can get in London about Shakespeare, right? Every nation, every culture has its own, great literary hero, which you can't imagine, reading him in any foreign language. Only the Yiddish translation of Shakespeare was famously advertised as being verteidigt und verbessert, translated and improved in the Yiddish. Only once you've read it, and only once you've read Lear in the original Yiddish do you truly appreciate it. But that was just a kind of Yiddish man's arrogance. But obviously we read in translation all the time, right? And even when we don't read in translation, when we're reading the classics, so much is lost. Do we really appreciate every reference and cultural hint between the lines of Shakespeare today, even though we are readers of English? No, we certainly don't. And of course, there are very many, scholarly reference works that will help fill in those blanks, but you don't need that. You don't need that to understand the meaning of Hamlet or King Lear or Macbeth, right? The meaning is plain. And it's a mistake to think that, we can't. I remember when I was in high school, when ninth grade, they started teaching us Shakespeare. And I remember there was just this sense that, Shakespeare's really hard. I mean, I think the teachers did us a disservice by creating this kind of idea. It's actually, in other contexts in my work in education, I've compared it to sometimes what happens when students begin learning Gemara here in Israeli schools. When students begin learning Gemara towards the end of elementary school, they're told Gemara is very serious. We were told Shakespeare is very serious. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of work. It scares everybody off even before they open the book, right? They become convinced that they can't do it. They become convinced that this is too hard for them. There is no, we have here in Jerusalem, there's a wonderful amateur Shakespeare company they perform they do Shakespeare in the Park every summer in Jerusalem. And we take our kids, we have younger children, and we've been doing it for years from the time they were very young. It's amazing. They're able to follow certainly the outlines of the plot. Besides the fact that Shakespeare was written to be consumed by the masses. It wasn't some kind of highfalutin thing that only the intelligentsia would understand. Right? Even school children are able to understand Shakespeare, and certainly able to understand Agnon. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to catch every reference to Chazal, or, by the way, to very many historical references that were contemporary to Agnon's time, earlier in the 20th century. Historical figures, historical events, both in Europe and Germany and in the land of Israel. That's why we have scholarship. That's why we have reference works. And, after all, we do all carry around the collected wisdom of civilization in our pockets. If one need to, we can, look things up. But the stories themselves are eminently understandable. And that's why they have such universal appeal. Some stories are a little easier to swallow, others require a little more heavy lifting in terms of understanding certain concepts and whatnot. But I think that's the answer to the question. Now, that being said, there is no doubt that those of us that are familiar with the rabbinic canon and the rabbinical texts, even very many Americans who are fluent in rabbinic sources, but for whatever reason won't or can't read modern Hebrew literature in the original and will read it in translation. Even in translation, in a good translation, those readers will or should catch a lot of the references, even in translation, to classical sources, the classical mikorot, to verses in the Bible or passages in the rabbinic writings, and we'll be able to consider, oh, what is he doing by drawing our attention to that particular Gemara? And when he does that, what is he doing? Sometimes Agnon made a reference to some classical source, just because that was the kind of, he wanted to pepper his prose with those kinds of turns of phrase. It's just simply a linguistic turn. Other times, he's trying to create an intertextual bridge, where he's trying to get us to consider, oh, well, how does this modern story, how is it built on the template of an Agadah? Right? How is this modern story somehow in dialogue with that classical text? And then sometimes he's doing it ironically. He's taking the source out of context. He's flipping it on its head in order to draw our attention to exactly how deviant the plot here is from the classic template. And of course, people, interpreters of with integrity can debate, which kind of source is it? Is it this or is it that or is it the other thing? And that's part of the work of interpretation of the text. But first, those sources have to be identified. But even if you don't identify them, like I presume those judges in Stockholm, you understand this is world-class literature. It works on the level of the surface reading without having to go underneath in order to tease out all of those references.